Welcome back. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought your silence meant weakness, this story is going to sit with you for a while. Before we start, if courtroom stories where the quiet one wins the whole room end up being your favorite kind, subscribe now, because the moment she opens that leather folder is the moment everything the tabloids believed about this man falls apart. The morning it happened, the Busan Central District Court filled up 90 minutes before the doors were supposed to open. Reporters saved seats the way people save seats at a title fight. Somewhere in that building, a man who had frightened an entire port city for 30 years sat waiting to be sentenced for crimes he had not committed, and the only person alive who could prove it was a woman the press had never managed to photograph. To understand how she got there, you have to go back 15 winters, to a harbor where the wind came off the water like it had a grudge. Yoon Tae-sung had not walked down to the old fish market at 2 in the morning to be kind. Men in his line of work rarely did anything at 2 in the morning that could be called kind. He had come to settle a problem with a customs officer who had recently discovered a conscience about which containers he stamped and which he didn't. The problem got settled, quietly. Tae-sung was walking back toward his car, coat collar up, when he heard a sound he could not immediately file away. A child, trying not to cry, and mostly winning. Under the concrete lip of the expressway ramp, in the pocket of dead air where the wind couldn't reach, a girl sat with both arms wrapped around a smaller child. She looked up at him, and what crossed her face was not fear. It was arithmetic. She was measuring him, deciding what kind of threat he was and how many exits she had, and from the way her body turned to put herself between him and the little one, she had already counted her exits and arrived at 0. "I'm not going to hurt you," Tae-sung said, which is the exact sentence every dangerous man in history has used to begin a conversation. She didn't move an inch. You say that like it's supposed to help. He crouched down anyway. Close enough now to see the smaller child's lips had gone gray. He took out a folded stack of bills and held it out. The girl looked at the money like he'd handed her a lit match. "That buys us tonight," she said. "It doesn't buy us tomorrow. So if you actually want to help, help properly. Otherwise, you're just paying to feel better on your drive home." Tae-sung had once had a man thrown off a moving ferry for shorting a shipment by a rounding error. He was not accustomed to being lectured. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had no line ready. Before he could find one, 2 shapes came around the pillar, the kind of men who worked this exact patch of harbor precisely because it looked from a distance like an easy score. One of them reached for the girl's arm. Tae-sung moved before he decided to. It took maybe 8 seconds. When it was over, both men were on the ground rethinking a number of recent decisions, and the girl had watched the whole thing without so much as blinking. She filed it away the way she filed everything, as data. "You're not a good man," she said. She said it the way you'd read a temperature. "No," Tae-sung agreed. "I'm not." The little one's breathing had gone shallow and wet. Her name was So-eun, the girl told him later, and she was 5. And she'd been running a fever for 6 days that no one had money to treat. Against 30 years of instinct that had kept him rich and breathing, Tae-sung picked the child up himself and carried her to the car. The older girl followed 3 steps back, refusing to let the gap close to 2. The hospital did what it could. It wasn't enough. 3 days later, in a corridor that smelled of disinfectant and other people's worst news, a doctor explained that the infection had spread too far and gone untreated too long. No one goes looking for a dying child under an expressway ramp. That is rather the point of expressway ramps. The girl didn't cry where anyone could see. Tae-sung only knew she had because he found her afterward in a stairwell, dry-eyed and furious, in the specific way of a person who has decided grief is a weakness she cannot afford. He didn't offer comfort, he offered a decision. "You're coming home with me. I don't want charity." "Good, because this isn't charity. Charity is cheap, and I've never been able to afford cheap things." He looked at her for a long moment. "This is a decision. I make those carefully. And I don't take them back." Something that was almost, not quite, a smile touched the corner of her mouth. "That's the first honest thing you've said all night." Her name was Han Mi-rae. His men, when they heard, assumed a stroke, a blackmail scheme, a lapse. Not one of them guessed the truth. which was that somewhere between arranging a man's disappearance and finding his car, Yoon Tae-sung had acquired a daughter he had absolutely no idea how to survive. Act 2. The Household. Mi-rae's first year in the Yoon house was less an adoption than a long, quiet siege, fought mostly at the dinner table. The house was built to intimidate. Floors polished to the point of hostility. Paintings on the walls worth more than the neighborhoods most of the staff had grown up in. People who moved through the rooms like they'd been trained never to be seen. Mi-rae saw all of it. She counted the two men posted outside a study that supposedly held nothing important. She noticed which conversations stopped the second she walked in. She noticed that her new father's business partners wore beautiful suits and nervous smiles, and that the two things were connected. She was 10 when she finally said something. "The trading office on Chunggang Road doesn't trade anything," she announced over dinner, the way another child might announce a fact about volcanoes. "I checked the filings at the library. It has 11 employees and no customers. You're washing money through it." Tae-sung set down his chopsticks with the care of a man buying himself time. That's a heavy accusation from someone who still needs a stool to reach the sink. "I don't use a stool, I use the counter's edge. And it's not an accusation. I don't care enough to accuse you. It's just true." She went back to eating. That answer did more damage to his composure than any threat a rival had ever managed. He responded the only way he knew how, which was to throw money at the problem until it stopped bothering him. He hired tutors. When she outgrew them, he found better ones. When she outgrew those, he paid professors sums that made his own accountants wince to teach a child material they usually reserved for graduate students. He told himself it was about opportunity. Late at night, in the rare hours he was honest, he suspected it was closer to paying off a debt he couldn't name. By 13, she had read enough of the criminal code to make his lawyers uneasy when she sat in on meetings she was not invited to. She'd stand in the doorway with her arms folded and take an argument apart with the patience of someone who had already won and was waiting for the room to notice. "Your whole model," she told him one night, doing her homework at his desk instead of her own, "is built on people being too afraid to leave. That works right up until they stop being afraid. Then it goes down faster than anything else, because fear doesn't leave a forwarding address." He should have been angry. Any of his men would have paid for that kind of talk with a good deal more than a hard look. Instead, he found himself fighting something uncomfortably close to pride, which he buried immediately, because pride was a liability in a house full of people waiting for him to show a soft spot. It was around then that Ma Kyung-ho settled into the inner circle for good. Soft-spoken, endlessly polite, the kind of man who remembered every birthday and never once raised his voice. Tae-sung trusted him completely and without inspection, which is exactly the kind of trust that rots from the middle while everyone admires the surface. Mi-rae didn't trust him at all. "He agrees with you too much," she said one evening, watching Kyung-ho through the gap in a door. "That's loyalty. That's a strategy wearing loyalty's coat. People who are loyal argue with you sometimes. He never does. Watch his hands when you talk. He's not listening. He's taking inventory." Tae-sung waved it off as a teenager's suspicion. He had a syndicate to run, containers to move, rivals to manage, and a low hum of unease he refused to name. And every time Kyung-ho smiled at exactly the right second, somewhere in the machinery of that empire, patiently and over years, rather than weeks, that same man had already begun quietly moving money through companies with names too boring for anyone to question. Act 3. The Leaving. Mi-rae finished her final tutoring program at 17 with a record that should have opened any door in the world. Instead, she made a request that unsettled her father more than any threat ever had. "I want to study abroad, somewhere with real courts, real law, not the version you can buy a table at." He should have refused. He should have kept her close and kept her safe and kept her exactly where he could see her. Instead, for reasons he would not fully understand until 15 years later in a room full of cameras, he said yes. She left for London 3 weeks after her 18th birthday, with 2 suitcases and a quiet that Tae-sung mistook for relief. A girl finally putting an ocean between herself and everything she'd grown up watching. He was wrong about that, though it would take him a long time to learn how wrong. Quick pause here, because this is the part most people scroll past and shouldn't. Think about the last time someone in your life only ever agreed with you, never pushed back, never told you a hard thing you didn't want to hear. We tend to call that person our closest ally. Mi-rae would have called them the most dangerous person in the room. If you've ever mistaken someone's silence for loyalty and paid for it later, tell me about it in the comments and subscribe, because the people who ask uncomfortable questions are the only ones worth keeping. What came to Tae-sung after that arrived in fragments. A law degree from a university that stopped returning his calls the moment he offered to fund a building. A name that quietly disappeared from every registry he could reach. Silence where updates used to be. He told himself she was building a life. He told his men, when they asked, that his daughter was managing her own affairs, which was true in a way that not one of them understood. Back in Busan, the empire developed a leak nobody could find. It started small, a manifest that didn't reconcile by a few 100 million won, waved off as a clerical slip. Then a partner in Incheon who had always been reliable stopped answering. Then a quiet audit, requested by a rival syndicate sniffing at Yoon territory, surfaced financial irregularities so specific and so perfectly documented that they could only have been planted by someone who understood the business from the inside out. Tae-sung brought the problem to the one man he trusted enough to fix it. Kyung-ho reviewed the documents with the calm, unhurried concern of a doctor reading test results he'd written himself. "Someone got careless," he said. "Let me handle it quietly. You've got enough on your plate." Tae-sung believed him. That was the tragedy of trust built without inspection. It works exactly as well as the person exploiting it needs it to. Act 4. The frame. Over the next 2 years, the leak became a flood. Front companies appeared in the filings. Blue Channel Logistics, Shongjin Freight Partners. Names so dull that no auditor's eye wanted to linger on them. Each one traced back, eventually and inevitably, to accounts bearing Yoon Tae-sung's authorization, an authorization Kyung-ho had spent the better part of a decade learning to reproduce, with the patience of a man who had always known the day would come when he'd need it. Captains who would once have taken a bullet for their boss started finding reasons not to meet his eyes in the hallway. Fear, which had been Tae-sung's most reliable tool for 30 years, quietly changed sides. Fear doesn't tell the difference between a boss under siege and a boss who has become the danger himself. It was somewhere in that slow unraveling that Mi-rae stopped answering entirely. No call, no email, no reason given. Just an absence that widened by degrees until it hardened into something that looked permanent, and a tabloid press that filled the silence the way tabloid presses always do. "Even his own daughter won't be in the same country as him," ran one headline, over a photograph of Tae-sung looking a decade older than he was, standing outside a courthouse for an unrelated matter, cast perfectly as the villain the story needed. His men expected him to hunt her down. He had crossed borders for men who'd merely insulted him at parties. Surely he'd move the earth for a daughter who'd vanished. He didn't move at all. "She earned the right to leave without being chased," he told the one lieutenant brave enough to ask. It wasn't surrender. It was the closest thing to respect he had ever learned to give, the same respect she'd demanded of him under a ramp 15 years earlier when she'd refused his money and told him exactly what she needed instead. What none of them knew, what wouldn't surface until a courtroom in Busan filled with prosecutors already tasting a win, was that Mi-rae had not run from her father's world. She'd left to learn a language sharp enough to take it apart. When the prosecutors finally filed formal charges against Yoon Tae-sung, built on evidence so clean it should have made a careful person suspicious, they believed the case was already over. His own lawyers thought so too. They'd run out of angles 2 weeks before the trial even started. Nobody in that building knew that the vanished daughter had already been working the same file for 3 years, from the other side of the world, under a name the tabloids had never bothered to trace. Act 5. What she was really doing. Mi-rae had found the first front company 2 years into her disappearance, buried in a filing she'd pulled out of pure habit. The same habit that once made a 10-year-old count guards outside a door that led to nothing. Blue Channel Logistics. The name meant nothing to anyone else on Earth. To her, trained since childhood to notice exactly this kind of deliberate, boring camouflage, it meant everything. A shipping consultancy with no ships, no clients, and a registered address that turned out to be a mailbox in a strip mall 2 hours outside Singapore. She didn't call her father. Calling would have meant explaining, and explaining too early would have cost her the one advantage she had. So she did what she'd spent 7 years training to do. She went quiet, and she went to work. She'd chosen her specialty on purpose. Not criminal defense, financial and maritime law, the unglamorous machinery of how money crosses borders and hides inside cargo. She'd spent her nights in the parts of the law library nobody visited, learning the architecture of exactly the kind of empire she'd grown up inside, so that one day she could read its blueprints backward. Now she pulled the thread. She retained 2 forensic document examiners, the kind who can tell you which of 40 near-identical signatures was made by a right hand pretending to be a different right hand. She opened requests for records in Singapore, then Panama, then Switzerland, then a small island called Jersey that exists mostly so that money can go there and rest. She filed under her own registered name, one the Busan tabloids had never connected to Yoon Tae-sung, because a woman with a foreign law license and a boring specialty does not make headlines. Every few months, a rival prosecutor somewhere would close a door she'd been about to walk through. Every few months, she found another one they hadn't thought to lock. Slowly, a shape emerged from the paper. The forged manifests all led back to her father's authorization, exactly as designed. But underneath them, 3 years earlier than the earliest document the prosecution would ever put in front of a jury, sat a single account. It had been opened at a private bank in Jersey, with a bearer arrangement meant to make the true owner untraceable. Except the owner had signed the opening documents himself, in his own hand, and pressed his own thumb to the notary's pad, back when he was still a decade away from needing to be careful about it. Ma Kyung-ho. 3 years before the first grain of evidence against her father existed, the man Tae-sung trusted without inspection had already built the account that everything else would eventually flow through. She had him. She'd had him for months. She just wasn't going to waste it on a phone call. By the time the prosecutors set a trial date, Mi-rae had a folder that could survive anything. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was aiming. ACT 6. The courtroom. The morning of the verdict, the gallery was full 2 hours early. Reporters staked out seats. Members of the rival syndicate sat in the back, not troubling to hide how satisfied they were, dressed like men attending a funeral they had personally arranged. Yoon Tae-sung sat at the defense table in a suit that no longer fit him, not because he'd lost weight, but in the way clothes stop fitting a man who has spent months absorbing blow after blow with no way to answer. Across the aisle, the lead prosecutor went through his notes one last time with the relaxed thoroughness of a man checking a bag he already knew was packed. The forged manifests went into evidence. The laundered accounts, meticulously documented. The reproduced authorization, confirmed by a handwriting expert who spoke with the flat certainty of someone who had never once stopped to wonder who might have taught the forger to do it so well. Tae-sung's lead attorney had the pallor of a man rehearsing how to lose gracefully, because losing gracefully was the only option still on the table. That was the exact moment the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Mi-rae walked in. She was not the girl who had vanished. She moved like someone who had built an entirely new person in the years since, and built her on purpose. Sharp suit, sharper posture. A single leather folder held like it weighed more than paper had any right to weigh. The room didn't place her. Tae-sung did, in the half-second before his mind caught up to his eyes, the way a body recognizes a person before the brain finishes the math. Mi-rae, he said, and it came out barely louder than a breath. Several reporters in the front row watched something they had traveled to see the opposite of. They watched Yoon Tae-sung's composure crack in a way no amount of legal pressure had managed in 8 months. She walked to the bench with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this more times than she would ever admit out loud. Your Honor, I'm requesting to be entered as co-counsel for the defense. I'm licensed to practice, and I have evidence directly relevant to the charges before this court. The prosecutor objected before she'd finished the sentence. Judge Seo, intrigued despite herself, overruled him. Partly procedure, partly the plain human need to know what was in that folder. What followed over the next 2 hours took the prosecution's case apart with the patience of someone who had spent a decade assembling the tools for exactly this. Her document examiners testified to differences in the forged authorization too fine for the original defense team to catch, the small tells of a right hand imitating another right hand. Bank records from 3 countries, obtained through channels the prosecution had never thought to close, established where the front companies had actually been born, not in her father's office, in a mailbox outside Singapore, feeding an account in Jersey. Then she set the folder on the rail, open to a single page, an account opening record, a signature, a thumbprint, a date. The crime this court has been looking for did not begin with my father's name, she said, loud enough for the cameras, calm enough that it landed like a verdict already read. It began with his. 3 years before the earliest document the prosecution has shown you today even existed. Ma Kyung-ho was in the gallery, seated as a witness for the prosecution, watching his own architecture come down in real time. The prosecutor, feeling the floor move under a case he'd been sure of an hour earlier, asked for a recess. Judge Seo denied it. "We'll finish today," she said, and something in her voice suggested she had realized the room had become far more interesting than anyone had prepared it to be. Kyung-ho stood before his own attorney could stop him. "That document is a forgery," he said, "the same as the rest of this performance." "It's notarized in 3 jurisdictions," Mi-rae answered, without raising her voice, which somehow made it land harder than shouting could have. "So perhaps you'd like to explain to the court why your signature and your thumbprint are on a private account 3 full years before my father supposedly committed a single crime." The gallery, which had arrived expecting a formality and a tidy ending, went completely silent. The specific silence of several hundred people realizing at the same instant that they were watching something that would be on every news channel in the country by dinner. Kyung-ho didn't sit down. For 30 years, he had been the calmest man in every room, the soft-spoken one who never showed his hand. That skill left him all at once. "You don't understand what you've just done," he said, and the polite mask slipped all the way off, showing the cold thing that had apparently been underneath the entire time. "You think you saved him." Because his daughter had asked him to. For the first time in 30 years, he chose her rule over his own reflex. Act 7. What they built. It took the court another 20 minutes to fully settle. When it did, Judge Seo ordered a formal review of the new evidence, with clear signals about which direction that review was going to go. Tae-sung didn't speak until the recess, alone with Mi-rae in a side room too small for everything neither of them had said in 15 years. "You built all of this," he said. "It wasn't a question. I built it because you were the only mistake you ever made on purpose that I refused to let go to waste." She held his eyes. "You told me, that first night, that it wasn't charity, that it was a decision. This is mine." He looked at her for a long time and didn't trust his voice to answer. The charges against Yoon Tae-sung were formally dismissed 6 weeks later. Kyung-ho's own trial began the following spring and ended with a sentence long enough to make the loyalty he'd spent 30 years faking finally cost him something real. The empire that came out the other side was not the one that went in. Smaller. Legal, in the boring and inconvenient ways that legal things are. Stripped of the fear that had been its foundation for 3 decades and considerably harder to run without it. Tae-sung discovered an uncomfortable truth in the years that followed. Fear had been efficient. Accountability was slow, argumentative, and occasionally humiliating. In meetings where men he'd once controlled with a look now felt entitled to disagree with him out loud. It was also, he admitted somewhere around the 2nd year, the first version of his life that had ever actually let him sleep. The foundation Mi-rae built with what was left funded 9 shelters across Busan, 2 legal aid clinics near the harbor, and a scholarship program quietly responsible for putting more kids through university than the tabloids ever bothered to count. Redemption stories without a villain to sneer at make for thin headlines. Winter came back to Busan the way it always did, with no apology and no warning, cracking the concrete and testing everyone's coats. The old fish market looked the same as it always had. Gray. Unremarkable. The kind of place people walked past without a second look, which was exactly why it had once hidden two children so completely from a city that should have found them sooner. Yoon Tae-sung stood beneath the ramp now, older, collar up against a wind that felt less like an enemy than it used to. Beside him, Mi-rae set down a box of warm food, the way they had done every winter since the trial, a small ritual that had begun as her insistence and become, somewhere along the way, the thing he looked forward to most all year. "You didn't have to keep doing this," she said, watching him arrange the box with more care than the job required. "Neither did you." She almost smiled. "I was wrong about you, you know, that first night. I told you that you weren't a good man. You weren't wrong." "I was," she said. "I just hadn't seen the rest of the math yet." They stood in the cold for a while, the kind of quiet that had once been a war between them and had turned, slowly, over 15 winters, into something close to peace. "Same time next year?" she asked. "Same time every year," he said, "for as long as there's a market standing." They left the food where they always left it, not as a symbol, not as penance for a past neither of them could undo. As a plain, practical answer to a plain, practical need, the same answer a freezing 8-year-old had demanded of him the very first night. Somewhere across the city, under another ramp, another child was probably cold tonight, probably hungry, probably running the same quiet arithmetic Mi-rae once had, deciding whether the stranger in front of them was a threat or, against every reasonable expectation, a second chance. Compassion, it turned out, wasn't the soft and sentimental thing the tabloids like to mock. In the right hands, it was strategy. Patient, deliberate, paid out over 15 years, one decision at a time, until a starving girl under a ramp and the man who once terrified an entire port had built together the one kind of empire that was ever actually built to last. If this one stayed with you, do 2 things before you go. Tell me in the comments about the person in your life who only tells you what you want to hear, because I promise you're not the only one who has one. And subscribe, so the next story finds you when it's ready. There's always another one coming, and the quiet ones are always the ones worth waiting for.